So what's the relation between Buddhist practice and psychotherapy or psychotherapeutic practice? When do we want one? When do we want the other? Coming up in today's video. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So Buddhist practice and psychotherapy. There was a recent, very interesting article in Tricycle magazine by C.W. Huntington Jr. Called, "Are You Looking to Buddhism When You Should Be Looking to Psychotherapy or Therapy? The ultimate goal of Buddhist practice isn't about achieving mental health." And here Huntington, although he isn't himself a therapist or a psychotherapist, raises a lot of really trenchant and important issues that I think we should consider on today's video and in general when we're approaching Buddhist practice, or any kind of practice really. Now, as for the differences, I'll say that I've done both. I've been in psychotherapy, I've been in Buddhist practice, and so I can recognize that there are some very, very important differences between them. And although they overlap in a lot of very interesting ways that we're only discovering now, they should not be thought of as the same thing. And I think sometimes people tend to sort of elide the two together or run the two together in ways that may not be very helpful. So psychotherapy in particular deals with the issue of mental health, which is defined, it's really not well defined except in distinction to certain mental disorders, sort of a list of mental disorders. It's not easy to define what we mean by health, of course, but of any kind really, but we can define it, and usually is defined, in distinction to what we consider to be illness, mental illness or mental disorder. And we can think of a sort of a list of them, including anxiety disorders, PTSD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, schizophrenia, all kinds of substance abuse, all kinds of sort of similar disorders. And if you go to the website of the National Institutes of Mental Health, they have a list of them. You can find them many places if you're interested in what that list might look like. And the traditional treatment options for these kinds of disorders involve either medication or various kinds of psychotherapy as two of the sort of most prominent. There are other ones as well, but we'll leave those aside for now. Basically, it comes down to taking some kind of medication for them or going through psychotherapy. Now, what is psychotherapy? What is the point of it? Of course, there are many different approaches to psychotherapy, and many different kinds, but in general, they're an attempt to sort of come to terms with our history in many years ago, or history with a certain kind of traumatic event, history with our childhood, history with our family, and to try to sort of weave that together, that history, in a way that's more helpful to us going forward. And generally, this is done in a one-on-one setting. And it's trying to get us a sort of a more integrated, more useful sort of a sense of self in the conventional sense of a person who can act skillfully and usefully in the world. That is so that we can achieve a sort of a baseline of normal functioning and of normal happiness. For example, if we are prone to depression, then we're in a state that is not sort of in a normal, sad state, but is a really problematic kind of disorder that can turn over our lives and make us not capable of doing much of anything. And since these interventions involve particular listed disorders, it comes under what I would call the medical model of treatment options. That is to say, it comes under a very high bar for what we consider valuable or not. Treatment that is under the medical model has to be proven. It has to be tested and investigated rigorously in distinction to other kinds of options, or in distinction to a placebo option. The strongest of these is generally reserved for medicines in particular, drugs in particular. Those have to be, or should be, tested in a double-blind, placebo-controlled kind of test, where we are basically excluding the possibility that the tester's fingers on the scales by blinding them to which is the correct the supposedly efficacious medicine and which is the placebo. And since they don't know which is which, they can't necessarily react or know how to react about whether a patient seems to be affected properly by the medication. The bar should be very high if we are attempting to or claiming to cure what amounts to a medical kind of disease, a disease of real human functioning, so that we make sure that only effective medications are given, or effective treatments of whatever kind are given, and so that we get away from the problems we've had in decades and centuries past, where various kinds of quack medicines or snake oils were prescribed, oftentimes at very high cost, that really had no more than a placebo effect. Now, in contradistinction to this, Buddhist practice, at least in its most usual form, is an attempt to find, for want of a better term, the best sort of life. And this is supposed to take place in a background of general healthy human functioning. That's what it assumes. That is, general healthy human functioning in the conventional kind of way. Now, we'll all come to this and say, well, but I know of myself, I've had problems with, let's say, depression or PTSD or whatever it might be, and Buddhist practices help me there. That may be, but we're talking about effects that are in general, along the edges. Everyone's different, and everyone will have different kinds of histories. But in general, the kinds of effects that interact with, let's say, these disorders, mental disorders I've discussed before, generally happen when people are not at the very hardest end of that disorder. They happen for people who are, let's say, coming out of the disorder or have a mild version of it, or are integrated enough in their conventional self that they're able to come to the practice and interact with it in a useful way. Just to take one example, Buddhist practice would almost certainly not be indicated for somebody with schizophrenia, which is a very serious mental illness, and one that is very difficult to treat even with the most advanced medications. And I'll say that one related problem here of people who come to Buddhist practice with a kind of a mental disorder involves things such as spiritual bypassing. And I've known, again, in my own history, which is not very serious, but I know that Buddhist practice, in particular practices of calming meditation, even light jhana meditation, which is a form of intensive mental focusing, can be used to spiritually bypass things. And this is something I've given a talk on. If you're interested in hearing more about spiritual bypassing, I'll put a link to the lecture, to the video up here. But in general, the idea is that we can calm ourselves to a state where we aren't immediately bothered by whatever the disorder is, and so we go on with our life without actually dealing with the disorder in its most fundamental level. So if we do that, we're pretty much guaranteeing that the disorder will come back again, and probably even worse, because we haven't dealt with it. And so the problem with relying solely on, let's say, a Buddhist practice to deal with these kinds of disorders is that we aren't really dealing with the root issue, which is coming to terms with distant histories in our own life, often. Because in Buddhist practice, those kind of deep stories are often left aside. We're not really supposed to be interacting with them. They involve what is called papancha, or proliferation, within the Buddhist context. Mental proliferation is part of the problem that we're trying to get away from. We're trying to get our way through, let's say, to trying to come to terms with. Insofar as we're dealing with these ancient stories in our own life, we're really not engaging with practice on its most fundamental level. And here I'll refer to a very interesting talk by Shinzen Young, who was a contemporary meditation teacher, who often is sort of runs at the borderline between Buddhism and science. And here he discusses a bit of what he sees as the distinctions between Buddhist practice and psychotherapy. So what he says is that within Buddhism we're looking at older stories. We're looking at stories from, let's say, months ago, if it was a trauma, or years ago, or decades ago, or even our early childhood, or our family environment where we grew up. We're looking at stories from long ago and trying to integrate ourselves with those stories. Whereas in Buddhist practice, the stories, quote unquote, that we're looking at are stories that are very recent. So we're looking at the story of what happened before we sat down to meditate. We're looking at the story of what happened to us earlier on that day, of what happened to us yesterday. We're looking at the story that arises with a pain in our knee, or that arises with a noise that distracts us during our sit. So we're looking at stories on a time scale that is much more compressed, much more recent. Whereas in psychotherapy, what we're looking at is stories that are much older. I think those two kinds of techniques or strategies or practices need to be kept to an extent distinct so that we don't put the wrong one in the wrong place. And when I say that, I certainly don't mean to deny that there is an enormous space for cross-fertilization here. We've already seen it a lot around us if we've been paying attention to a lot, people discussing Buddhism nowadays. Often if you go to a Buddhist talk or retreat or a meditation session, many of the people in the audience will be psychologists themselves, psychotherapists themselves, because they're trying to come to Buddhism and try to find some concepts or ideas or practices they can use within psychotherapy. So there's a lot of room for cross-fertilization. But I think it's going to take time to sort of work all that out. And I think we have to be aware of that some of the techniques will cross over very easily and others won't. And then it may very well be that we don't know which ones, or I should say we don't know which ones are which exactly yet. That will take time to test, because as I say, the therapeutic model, the psychotherapy model, is a medical model. And so it takes time to define our terms, to understand exactly what we mean by, let's say, meditation, what we mean by mindfulness, what we mean by loving-kindness meditation, how long we have to practice, under what circumstances. Those things need to be tested. And they're being tested right now, but my own estimation is it's going to take quite a long time to get this stuff straight. So in the meantime, I think we have to be aware of the fact that these are distinct practices, and that we try to be aware of where we are on that kind of continuum. And in particular, I would also urge any of you who feel that you have a mental disorder to get it treated before you go into Buddhist practice, or at least at the same time as Buddhist practice, and to discuss that with your doctor or with the practitioners you're working with in the Buddhist practice as well, so that everybody knows what you're doing and what page you're on. Because I know from an anecdotal point of view, from my own experience, that I've been in contexts of Buddhist practice where it was pretty clear to me that some of the people who were there really had disorders of various kinds, or at least what seemed to me to be issues that were quite a bit deeper and more profound than could be dealt with within a Buddhist context. And as a result, I thought that they were probably not going to get as much out of them. Now, of course, I'm only coming in as an outsider, so I'm only saying this as a supposition, but I think the supposition is enough that I want to raise it in this video in case some of you are going through the same things, just to keep it in the back of your mind. I think that's the best way to come at the issues that I've been discussing in these videos of a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, is to get whatever mental disorders there are out of the way while or before you come to a Buddhist practice. And I'd be interested to know how you deal with this yourself, what you see in your own life, what you've seen with others. So put it in the comments and questions down below if you have any questions about this. I'd really be interested in hearing. If you're interested also in deeper dive into some of these issues and some more sort of side kind of issues that I'll raise, come over to my Patreon page. We'll try to do some fun things over there. And meanwhile, we will catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks a lot. Bye-bye.